What happens when a woman fighting to save her family's soul meets a man who hasn't felt his own heartbeat in 4 years? Jin Woo was the king of a frozen empire, a man of silk suits and iron blood who lived in a self-imposed winter. His rules were absolute: total control, no distractions, and never let them see you bleed. But Vera Maya had a fire that could melt ice. She was supposed to be just another desperate face in the crowd at the underground auction, a temporary fix for a man who had forgotten how to feel. The most dangerous man in the city didn't know that by bringing her into his penthouse, he wasn't just finding a muse, he was finding his master. Her warmth and her defiance were about to bring the King of Winter to his knees. It had been exactly 1,460 days since I felt a single spark of desire. I sat in my office, the city lights of Seoul bleeding through the glass, listening to my advisors tell me the same thing. There was nothing physically wrong with me. My lack of interest in women was psychological, a verdict of ice. I had everything: power, wealth, a name that made men tremble, and yet I was a ghost in my own skin. Until the night of the auction.
I wasn't there for the jewelry or the art. I was there to feel the cold comfort of my own shadow. But then she walked onto the floor. Vera Maya. She stood there with her rich, glowing skin and curls that looked like dark silk, holding on to a family heirloom as if it were her last breath. She was drowning in debt, fighting to save a jazz club that was the only piece of her father she had left. In a room full of predators, she was the only one who didn't look away when our eyes met. For the first time in 4 years, the silence in my chest broke. I didn't ask. I didn't negotiate. I leaned toward my men and gave the only command that mattered. That one: bring her to me. The deal I offered her was simple: stay in my home, be my muse, let me remember what it's like to be alive. She thought she was stepping into a cage to save her heritage, but she didn't realize that the shy girl in my bed was about to become the only person in the world who could truly own me.
Jin Woo sat in the back of his obsidian black sedan, the neon lights of Seoul blurring into streaks of cold blue and clinical white against the window. He didn't look at the city, he looked at his own reflection, or rather, the man he had become, a statue of silk and silence. It had been exactly 4 years, 1,460 days since the warmth had left his blood. To the world, he was the apex predator of the Atlas Syndicate, a man whose sharp, angular features and intense dark eyes could freeze a heart with a single glance. But inside he was a desert. He adjusted the luxury chronograph on his wrist, the leather strap feeling like a shackle. Even the ticking of the seconds felt hollow. Every doctor, every specialist, every gift sent by his rivals to tempt him had met the same wall of ice. He was dominant, he was dangerously charismatic, and he was completely, utterly dead to the touch of a woman. Across the city, in a neighborhood where the neon lights flickered and the paint was peeling, Vera Maya stood in the center of the midnight blue. The air in the jazz club smelled of old wood, brass polish, and a growing, suffocating desperation. She ran a hand through her voluminous curls, her rich, dark skin glowing faintly under the dim amber stage lights. The silence of the empty club was louder than any music. In her hand she clutched a final foreclosure notice, the paper crumpled from the sweat of her palms. This place was her father's soul, a legacy of rhythm and sanctuary in a world that wanted to pave it over with glass skyscrapers. She needed a miracle, or she needed to sell the only thing she had left, a heritage piece that had belonged to her grandmother, a sapphire as deep as the ocean.
Her phone vibrated on the bar. A text from a debt collector, short, cold, and final. If she didn't have the money by tomorrow, the locks would be changed. Vera looked at her reflection in the back bar mirror. Her full lips were set in a line of grim determination.
She wasn't just a girl in trouble. She was a woman with fire in her veins, and she refused to let the music die. She smoothed down her black lace camisole, the delicate fabric a sharp contrast to the weight of the world on her shoulders. She would go to the underground auction at the Diamond Gala tonight. She would walk into the lion's den and sell her past to save her future. She didn't know that the King of Winter was already waiting in the shadows, and that for the first time in 4 years, the ice was about to crack.
The grand ballroom of the Diamond Gala was a cathedral of excess, dripping in crystal chandeliers and the scent of expensive champagne. Vera Maya felt like a shadow moving through a hall of mirrors. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that contrasted with her outward composure. She smoothed the silk of her black camisole, her rich, dark skin luminous under the harsh glow of the spotlight as she stepped toward the appraisal table. In her velvet-lined box lay the Star of the Nile, the sapphire that carried the weight of her father's legacy and her only hope for survival. The auctioneer's voice was a rhythmic drone, selling off pieces of history to people who had more money than souls. But Vera's eyes were fixed on the back of the room, where the true power resided. Jin Woo sat in the shadows of the velvet-curtained VIP tier, a ghost in a tailored suit. He watched the proceedings with a clinical boredom that had become his only companion. For 4 years he had been a man watching a black-and-white film, disconnected from the pulse of the world. He adjusted his cufflink, the black tattoo on his wrist catching the light, a permanent reminder of the betrayal that had turned his blood to ash. He was ready to leave, his body already signaling the familiar heavy fatigue of a man who felt nothing, when the girl stepped onto the platform. The air in the room seemed to thin. Jin Woo's hand froze on the arm of his chair. Vera Maya didn't look like the other socialites. She looked like a wildfire trapped in lace. As she handed over her heirloom, she tilted her head back, her expressive eyes scanning the room with a defiance that bordered on a challenge. Then she found him. Across the expanse of the ballroom, through the haze of perfume and the chatter of the elite, their gazes locked. It wasn't a spark, it was a detonation. For the first time in 1,460 days, a violent jolt of electricity shot through Jin Woo's spine. His breath hitched, his lungs suddenly burning as if he had been submerged in ice and finally broken the surface. The dull ache in his chest vanished, replaced by a thundering, predatory heat that pooled in his gut. His dark eyes narrowed, tracking the curve of her throat, the rise and fall of her chest, and the way her full lips parted in a silent gasp as she felt the weight of his stare. The Star of the Nile was being announced, but Jin Woo didn't hear the numbers. He only heard the sound of his own blood rushing back to life. The ice hadn't just cracked, it had shattered into a million jagged pieces. He didn't want the stone, he wanted the fire. He leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing, and whispered a single devastating command to the shadow standing behind him. That one. Stop the bidding. Bring her to me. The auction floor became a blur of hushed whispers and confusion as the bidding for the Star of the Nile was abruptly silenced. Vera felt a firm, gloved hand on her elbow, guiding her away from the podium and through a set of heavy gilded doors. She was led through a private corridor that smelled of expensive tobacco and cedar, away from the light of the ballroom and into the belly of the beast. The air here was cooler, stiller, as if the very atmosphere knew better than to disturb the occupant of the VIP lounge. The doors clicked shut behind her. The room was bathed in soft, amber shadows, illuminated only by the city lights bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling glass. Jin Woo was standing by the window, his back to her, a glass of dark liquid in his hand. The silence was heavy, vibrating with a tension that made the fine hairs on Vera's arms stand up. "You have a habit of looking people in the eye, Vera Maya," he said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that seemed to hum right through her skin. He turned slowly, the movement fluid and predatory. Up close, his features were even sharper, a face carved from granite and moonlight.
Most people know better than to stare at a ghost. Vera swallowed, her pulse thundering in her throat, but she didn't drop her gaze. I wasn't staring at a ghost. I was looking for a buyer. Why did you stop the auction? Jin Woo moved towards her, his stride slow and deliberate. Each step felt like an encroachment on her very air. He didn't stop until he was inches away, close enough for her to smell the intoxicating scent of sandalwood and rain. He was a towering presence of broad shoulders and tailored wool, his energy so dominant it felt like a physical weight.
"I don't care for the stone," he murmured, his dark eyes tracing the curve of her jaw before settling on her lips. He reached out, his index finger gently but possessively lifting her chin. His touch was electric, a searing heat that made her breath hitch. "The stone is cold, static. I find I have a sudden, desperate need for something that burns." Vera felt a shiver of both fear and a strange, terrifying thrill. "I'm not for sale." "Everything is for sale when the price is survival," Jin Woo countered, his thumb grazing the line of her lower lip. His eyes were no longer cold. They were dark with a hunger that had been starving for 4 years. "You need a miracle to save your father's legacy. I need to remember what it feels like to be a man. We are going to make a deal, Vera, and in my world there is no such thing as no." The transition from the velvet shadows of the gala to the stark, towering heights of Jin Woo's penthouse was swift and silent. Vera sat in the back of his car, her fingers tracing the lace of her camisole as the city fell away beneath them. When the heavy doors clicked shut behind her, Vera was met with a cathedral of glass, steel, and marble. The air here was thin and smelled of expensive citrus and cold rain. It was a masterpiece of minimalism, but as the heavy doors clicked shut behind her, Vera realized it wasn't a home, it was a vault. Jin Woo moved through the space with a quiet, terrifying grace. He shed his suit jacket, tossing it onto a white leather sofa, and turned to look at her. The city lights of Seoul shimmered behind him, framing his broad shoulders in a halo of artificial gold. He looked at her not as a guest, but as a masterpiece he had just acquired, a rare find that finally gave him a reason to open his eyes. "This is where you will stay," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Your debts were settled the moment you stepped into this car. The club is safe. Your father's legacy is secure." Vera took a step forward, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. "And my role? You said I'm to be your muse. What does that mean, Jin Woo? Am I a prisoner here?" A slow, dangerous smile ghosted across his sharp features. He walked toward her, his presence expanding until she felt pinned against the glass wall. He didn't touch her, but he leaned in close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "There are guards at every exit, and my eyes are on every camera. You have everything you could ever want within these walls. Silk, gold, the finest wine. But you do not leave without me. You do not speak to anyone but me." Vera felt the weight of the cage settling over her. It was a golden one, draped in luxury, but a cage nonetheless. She looked up at him, her expressive eyes flashing with a mix of fear. And an undeniable magnetic pull. She was the fire he needed to feel alive. But as Jin Woo's gaze darkened with possessive intent, she realized the true danger. She wasn't just here to inspire the King of Winter. She was here to be consumed by him. The following evening, the penthouse was a tomb of silence, broken only by the low, mournful hum of a saxophone drifting from the hidden speakers. Vera stood in the center of the vast guest suite, staring at the wardrobe Jin Woo had provided. It was filled with silks and velvets that cost more than her jazz club, but her hand stayed on the black lace camisole she had arrived in. It was her armor. the last thing she owned that wasn't a product of his mercy. She stepped out into the main living area, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Jin Woo was sitting at the marble bar, a single amber light illuminating the sharp, tired planes of his face. He had discarded his tie, and the top buttons of his black shirt were open, revealing the pulse at the base of his throat. He looked less like a king and more like a man haunted by the very air he breathed. When he heard her footsteps, he turned. The glass in his hand froze halfway to his lips.
The air in the room didn't just thin, it vanished. Jin Woo's dark eyes swept over her, tracking the way the delicate lace clung to her curves and the rich, glowing warmth of her skin against the black fabric. For a man who'd lived in a 4-year winter, the sight of her was a solar flare. He saw the defiance in her eyes and the slight tremble in her hands, a combination that made his blood roar with a hunger he could no longer categorize as mere curiosity. He set the glass down with a sharp click and rose to his feet. Every step he took toward her was a silent promise of destruction. He didn't stop until the heat of his body was a physical weight against her. He reached out, his hand trembling almost imperceptibly as he gripped the edge of the marble counter behind her, pinning her in place. "I told you to wear the silk I bought you," he rasped, his voice a low, jagged vibration. "I'm not one of your statues, Jin Woo," Vera whispered, her breath hitching as he leaned in, his face inches from hers. "You can't dress me in your brand of silence." Jin Woo's gaze dropped to her lips, and for a heartbeat, the mask of the stoic Mafia boss shattered. The dominant, brooding control he prided himself on was being eaten alive by a desperate, primal need to simply feel. He leaned closer, his forehead almost touching hers, his scent of sandalwood and rain wrapping around her like a shroud. The tension was a living thing, a wire pulled so taut it was humming. His hand moved from the counter, his thumb grazing the strap of her camisole. The touch was electric, a spark that threatened to burn the entire penthouse down. But just as he moved to close the distance, he saw the flicker of genuine fear behind her courage. With a guttural sound of frustration, Jin Woo tore himself away. He turned his back to her, his shoulders heaving as he fought for air. "Go to your room, Vera," he commanded, his voice cold once more, though it lacked its usual edge. "Before I forget that you are my muse and start treating you like my prey." The weight of the silence Jin Woo left behind was heavier than his touch. Vera stood alone in the vast living room, the echo of his command still ringing against the cold marble. She didn't go to her room. Instead, driven by a restless magnetic curiosity, she drifted toward the one door that always remained shut, the entrance to his private study. It was a room that smelled of old paper, expensive scotch, and a grief so thick it felt like physical ash. The space was a mausoleum of memories. Unlike the rest of the penthouse, which was clinical and modern, this room was a sanctuary of the past. Vera's eyes fell upon a lacquer box resting on a desk of dark teak. Inside, she didn't find syndicate ledgers or rolls of cash. She found a photograph, the edges curled and yellowed. It was Jin Woo, 4 years younger, his sharp features softened by a genuine, rare smile. He was standing next to a woman and a young man who shared his brow and his eyes, his brother. Tucked beneath the photo was a police report. The ink faded, but the words "assassination attempt" and "internal betrayal" screaming from the page. As she read, the jagged pieces of the King of Winter began to form a picture. 4 years ago, on the night he was supposed to take the throne of the Atlas Syndicate, a coup had been staged by the person he trusted most, his own fiancée. The betrayal hadn't just cost him his empire for a time. It had cost him the life of his younger brother, who had taken a bullet meant for Jin Woo. Vera's breath hitched. She saw a small blood-stained ribbon at the bottom of the box, a remnant of a wedding that never happened and a life that had ended in fire. Jin Woo hadn't just lost interest in women, he had buried his heart in the same grave as his brother. His coldness wasn't a choice, it was a fortress built to ensure that no one could ever get close enough to hurt him or be hurt by him again. "You weren't supposed to find that." The voice was a low, dangerous rasp. Vera spun around to find Jin Woo standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the hallway. He looked at the box in her hands, and for a fleeting second the predatory mask slipped. His eyes weren't the eyes of a mafia boss. They were the eyes of a man still standing in the wreckage of his own soul. The ghost in the suite wasn't a memory of a woman, Vera realized. It was the ghost of the man Jin Woo used to be. The silence between them grew, no longer filled with tension, but with the heavy, shattering weight of a truth that changed everything. The grand crystal hall was a sea of opulence and filtered light, but tonight Jin Woo wasn't the only apex predator in the room. He stood at the top of the grand staircase, his hand resting possessively at the small of Vera's back. He had chosen her attire himself, a gown of shimmering midnight silk that draped over her curves like liquid moonlight. For the first time in 4 years, Jin Woo didn't feel like a ghost haunting his own life. With Vera on his arm, he felt like a king reclaiming a throne he had long ago abandoned to the ice. "Stay close," he murmured, his voice a low vibration near her ear. "The wolves in this room don't just bite, they wait for you to bleed." Vera walked with her head high, her rich, dark skin glowing against the diamonds he had fastened around her throat. She could feel the weight of 100 stares, but she only cared about the heat radiating from the man beside her. As they moved through the crowd, the sea of elite guests parted in a wave of hushed whispers. Jin Woo was no longer the silent, frozen myth of the Atlas Syndicate. He was a man reawakened, his dark eyes hyper-focused on every shadow. The atmosphere shifted when a man with a scarred brow and a smirk that didn't reach his eyes blocked their path. It was Kenji, a rival syndicate leader who had spent years trying to chip away at Jin Woo's borders. He looked at Vera with a slow, insulting visual sweep that made the air in the room turn jagged. "So, the rumors are true," Kenji drawled, his voice loud enough to draw a circle of onlookers. "The King of Winter finally found a space heater. She's a beautiful little thing, Jin Woo. Does she know she's just a replacement for the dead?" Vera felt Jin Woo's hand tightened against her waist, his fingers digging into the silk of her dress. The temperature in the immediate circle seemed to drop 20 degrees. Before Kenji could blink, Jin Woo had closed the distance. He didn't pull a weapon. He didn't need to. He simply stepped into Kenji's personal space, his broad shoulders casting a shadow that swallowed the smaller man. Jin Woo reached out, his tattooed hand gripping Kenji's jaw with a terrifying, controlled pressure. "Look at her again," Jin Woo whispered, his voice so calm it was lethal. "Mention my past again, and I will make sure the only thing people remember about you is the sound your bones made when I broke them." The dominance in his eyes was absolute. A predatory instinct that had been dormant for 4 years was now screaming for blood. Kenji's smirk vanished, replaced by a pale, shivering realization that the monster was fully awake. Jin Woo didn't wait for an apology. He turned Vera away, his hand sliding back to her waist, shielding her from the room. He had brought her here to show the world his queen, but in that moment of violence, Vera realized she had done more than just wake his heart. She had unleashed his protection. The ride back from the gala was draped in a heavy, contemplative silence that felt different from the icy voids of the past. The adrenaline of the confrontation with Kenji had settled into a low, simmering warmth that filled the cabin of the car. When they stepped back into the penthouse, the city lights below seemed smaller, less significant than the space between them. Jin Woo walked to his mahogany desk and picked up a single cream-colored envelope. He didn't look at it as he handed it to Vera. His eyes remained fixed on hers, dark and unreadable.
"It's done," he said, his voice a low velvet rasp. The deed to the midnight blue is in your name, fully cleared of all lines and encumbrances. Your family's legacy is no longer a debt, it's a promise. You are free, Vera." Vera took the envelope, her fingers trembling as she felt the weight of the paper that represented everything she had fought for. This was the miracle she had prayed for in the dim light of her empty club. She was no longer a captive, no longer a muse under watch. She could walk out the door, return to her music, and never look back at the shadows of the Atlas Syndicate. But as she looked at the paper, the triumph she expected felt strangely like grief. She looked up at Jin Woo. He was standing by the glass, his silhouette sharp and lonely against the skyline. He had given her back her life, but in doing so, he was stepping back into his own winter. The man who had broken his 4-year silence to protect her was now withdrawing into the quiet of his golden cage. "Is that all this was?" Vera asked, her voice barely a whisper. "A transaction?" Jin Woo turned, his expression tightening. "That was the deal. I saved your world, and you reminded me that I still have a pulse. The debt is paid." Vera dropped the envelope onto the marble table, the sound echoing in the vast room. She took a step toward him, her heart thundering with a new kind of defiance, one that didn't come from a need for survival, but from a terrifying realization. "You think you can just buy my freedom and send me away? You think I can go back to that club and pretend I didn't see the man behind the ice?" She reached out, her hand covering the black tattoo on his wrist. For the first time, Jin Woo didn't pull away. The heat between them was no longer a spark, it was a wildfire. Vera realized that the jazz club was her heritage, but this man had become her rhythm. She didn't want to go back to a world where he was just a ghost. The price of her heart wasn't the money he had spent. It was the freedom she was now willing to give up just to stay by his side. The air in the penthouse was thick, charged with the kind of electricity that precedes a seasonal shift. Jin Woo looked down at Vera's hand resting over the tattoo on his wrist, the warmth of her palm seeping through the ink and into his very marrow. For 4 years he had been a fortress of ice, but standing here, watching the woman who had traded her safety for his soul, the final walls crumbled. He didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his hand, interlacing his fingers with hers, his grip tight and grounding. "I thought I was saving you," he said, his voice dropping to a raw, jagged whisper. "I thought I was the one holding the keys to your cage. But the truth is, Vera, I was the one trapped in the dark. You didn't just wake me up. You made me realize that the throne I sat on was a tomb." He stepped closer, his broad shoulders blocking out the rest of the world until there was only the two of them in the amber glow of the city lights. He reached out with his free hand, his index finger tracing the line of her jaw with a reverence that replaced his former dominance. "It started as an obsession," he admitted, his dark eyes searching hers, no longer cold, but burning with a vulnerability he hadn't shown in a lifetime. "A need to possess the fire that broke my winter. But it's not enough to own you. I don't want a muse who lives in my shadow. I want a partner who stands in the light beside me." Vera looked up at him, her full lips parting as she felt the shift in the atmosphere. The master was gone, replaced by a man who was finally willing to be seen. She saw the strength in his features, the dangerous charisma that had first drawn her in, but she also saw the man who had lost everything and now offering her his world. "I'm not going back to the club to hide, Jin Woo," she said, her voice steady and filled with a new kind of power. "And I'm not staying here as your muse. If I stay as your equal. I want the music and the fire, and I want them with you."
Jin Woo leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. A slow, genuine smile, the one from the old photograph, touched his lips. "Then the Atlas Syndicate has a new reign," he murmured. He didn't order her this time. He waited until she leaned into him, and when his lips finally met hers, it wasn't a transaction or a deal. It was a coronation. The King of Winter had found his Queen of Fire. And for the first time in 4 years, the City of Seoul didn't look cold. It looked like a kingdom they would rule together.